So here's the moment it happened. I walked into work like any other Tuesday, coffee in hand, badge clipped, ready for another day as a mid-level analyst at a firm that had more buzzwords than integrity. My manager, Grant, called me into a conference room with the windows tinted just enough to make it feel like a polite interrogation chamber. There was no handshake, no smile, just a printed memo and his tone, too chipper to be innocent. "We've had to make some organizational changes," he said, sliding the paper across to me like it might bite. The document didn't even have my full name spelled right. What it did say was that my current position had been reevaluated for optimization, and I was being transferred temporarily to facilities support, starting immediately. I blinked. "Facilities support?" He nodded, folding his hands like he was proud of the phrase. "You'll be assisting with internal services, keeping the break room supplied, helping with guest coordination, and beverage distribution." That's right. They demoted me to T-Boy. No explanation, no warning, just a smiling Grant and a badge that now beeped for the basement storage room. You know what I did? I said thank you. Genuinely. Then walked out of that room and didn't slam the door, not because I wasn't angry, but because I didn't want them to hear it. Anger makes them feel important. Silence unnerves them. So I collected my things, what little I had, and moved my life down 2 floors and 3 pay grades. The facilities team wasn't bad, actually. They'd seen everything. People crying in stairwells, executives having hissy fits over expired oat milk. There was a kind of brutal honesty in their laughter, and I needed that more than prestige. My first task? Stock the conference rooms with tea, bottled water, and enough mints to freshen the entire board. My second? Smile and nod. Third? Listen. Watch. No one suspects the tea guy. You become part of the scenery. Invisible but present. And if you've ever worked corporate, you know that's a dangerous combination. 2 weeks in, I started learning things. Not from the spreadsheets, but from conversations I overheard between sips of chamomile. I learned who was leaking strategy decks to our competitor. I learned which senior manager was in a fake marriage to maintain a visa. And I learned that Grant, my former manager, was deeply insecure about his handwriting, which is objectively hilarious. It's amazing how much power you can gather just by topping off someone's jasmine tea and waiting. Still, none of that helped me get my job back. Not until he walked in. But that's a story for later. Right now, what mattered was this. I had 2 choices. I could mope, or I could brew the perfect cup of tea with spite and precision. And I chose the latter. Because if they were going to demote me, I was going to be the most respected T-boy this company had ever seen. People think humiliation is loud, red faces, broken voices, dramatic exits. But it's not. Humiliation is quiet. It's being handed a tray of mugs and told, make sure the CEO gets the mint blend, not the lemon. It's colleagues avoiding eye contact like your new job is contagious. It's realizing that half the office now greets you with the same tone they use for janitors and interns, polite, forgettable, 2 steps above silence. But I wasn't bitter. Not openly. I leaned into it. Every morning, I ironed my new facility's polo. I learned everyone's preferred sugar-to-coffee ratio. I labeled drawers that had gone unlabeled for years. My break room became a sanctuary of passive rebellion. Because when your dignity's been stolen, the next best thing is turning efficiency into performance art. The tea station? Immaculate. I installed a little chalkboard where I scribbled daily quotes, like open quote, "You can't spill the tea if I already served it," close quote. Even the interns laughed. Some started showing up early just to chat. And in that tiny corner of the building, I became relevant again, not to the org chart, but to the people. Which is when it happened. A young woman with braids, a fraying satchel, and the look of someone carrying too much responsibility walked into the break room. She was an intern, though clearly not from the Ivy pipeline our firm usually worshipped. She looked lost, not physically, but existentially. She stared at the vending machine like it owed her money, then sighed, sank into a chair, and muttered, "I just need 5 minutes not to cry." I didn't ask questions. I just handed her a cup of tea. "Rooibos, it tastes like confidence." She blinked. "You always talk like that? Only when people look like they need a plot twist." That got a laugh out of her. A real one. The kind you don't fake when your world is unraveling. Her name was Femi. We didn't talk much, just enough for her to say she was new, things were weird, and she wasn't sure she belonged here. I didn't say, you do. I said, they'll think you don't until the moment they need you. Then they'll act like they saw your potential the whole time. Another laugh, a thank you. She took the tea and left. I didn't expect to see her again. I certainly didn't expect what came next. 2 weeks later, I was refilling the mini fridge when the entire building shifted. Okay, not literally, but the kind of shift where people suddenly walk straighter. Ties are tightened, laptops are closed, phones vanish. The elevator dings 3 times and everyone pretends not to care while absolutely caring. A government delegation had arrived. This was not unusual. Our firm handled international logistics and consulting, and trade officials occasionally did walkthroughs. But this was different. Security badges were checked twice. Some managers actually sweat through their suits. I heard someone whisper minister, but couldn't catch more. Then Grant came bolting into the break room like a man running from bad karma. What's your name again? He snapped, even though we both knew he knew. I tilted my head. Still the same as last month. He ignored the dig. Someone at the front desk says there's a foreign dignitary asking for you, by name. I laughed, like a real from the stomach laugh. Yeah, okay. I'm serious, he hissed. Minister of Trade. From Nigeria or Kenya or something. He says he won't meet with anyone until you're brought up. Silence. Then the vending machine clunked, because apparently even fate loves timing. I stood, brushed off my uniform, and said the words I had been waiting for since the moment they demoted me. Guess someone needs tea. Open quote, open quote, open quote. I walked into the executive lobby like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to lose, mainly because both were true. The double glass doors slid open with their usual pneumatic sigh, and the first thing I saw was the receptionist's expression, stunned, confused, and slightly embarrassed. Like she couldn't quite process that this was the guy an international government minister had asked for by name. Then I saw him. Tall, regal posture, impeccable navy suit with a subtle West African pattern stitched into the lapels, cultural pride woven with diplomatic precision. He stood alone, hands clasped, eyes scanning the hallway like he was measuring its soul. And when he saw me, he smiled. Not a polite diplomat smile, not a we're on the clock smile. A real one. The kind of smile that says, there you are. Ah, he said, striding forward. You are the tea man? I shrugged. That's what they call me these days. He chuckled. Titles change. Actions stay true. Then, without waiting for a single executive to intervene, he gestured toward the elevator. Shall we speak somewhere quieter? Heads turned. Whispers fluttered. A VP tried to introduce herself and got waved off like a street vendor. He was here for me. Only me. And the room knew it. Upstairs, in one of the private meeting rooms, he declined the seat at the head of the table and sat beside me instead. Then he said, You once gave my daughter tea. I blinked. Excuse me? She was an intern, nervous, alone. You gave her tea and said something about plot twists. She came home and told me the man who ran the break room had more wisdom than her supervisor. My mind clicked. Femi, he continued. When she said your name again last night, I recognized it. I had seen it once, buried in a client report, so I requested this meeting. I couldn't speak, which is fine because he wasn't done. She is fine now, thriving in fact. But in that moment, she needed someone to notice her. You did, without an angle, without knowing who she was. He leaned in, and that is precisely the kind of person I wish to advise me. I swallowed. Advise you? I am assembling a global youth innovation panel. I want you on it. We'll formalize the offer, of course, but I needed to look into your eyes and see if they were still honest. That last word hit harder than I expected, because for months, I'd felt invisible. Insignificant, like I didn't matter beyond how well I stocked honey packets. And now here was a man who'd flown across continents for tea and decency. By the time we walked out of the meeting room, the executives were assembled like schoolchildren after a fire drill. They didn't know what we talked about, but they did know something had shifted. The minister paused at the door, looked around, and said loudly enough for the marble to echo, This young man was demoted for doing the right thing. I hope that is not your company's culture. Then he clapped me on the shoulder, smiled again, and left. The silence he left behind? Worth bottling. Back in the break room, Grant was waiting. He tried to play casual. So what was that all about? I poured myself a tea. Jasmine, of course. Told you someone needed tea. He forced a laugh. Hey, listen, we've been thinking it's time we moved you back into your analyst role, maybe even senior analyst. Just need you to sign some paperwork. I raised an eyebrow. No rush, got a few other offers to think through. The look on his face? Priceless, but not vengeful. Because the best revenge I was learning is simply being seen. The next morning, I walked in late on purpose. Not rude late, just enough to remind them I was no longer tethered to break room clocks and passive-aggressive Slack messages. I wore a crisp shirt instead of my usual polo. No badge. No lanyard. Just me, a cup of rooibos, and a phone that had started ringing with purpose. Apparently, news travels fast when a foreign minister drops your name in the lobby. I wasn't prepared for the reactions. The same people who used to hand me dirty mugs now gave me awkward half smiles. Some even nodded like we'd always been cool. A few interns whispered, "That's him," like I was a myth who came alive after hours. It was surreal, but also funny, because the only thing that had changed was perception. I was still me, still drinking tea in the corner, still observing, still invisible in the ways that counted, except now they wondered what I knew. Especially Grant. He called me into a glass conference room that afternoon. Classic Grant move, trap you with transparency. He'd already prepared a performance. Hey, buddy, he began with the warmth of a fridge door. We really dropped the ball, didn't we? I mean, temporary reassignment, tea duty. What were we thinking? He laughed alone. But good news, we've reinstated your analyst role. Full benefits, retroactive pay, maybe even a title bump in the next review cycle. I stared at him, sipping my tea. I'd brought my own ceramic mug now. It clinked softly against the table. He kept talking, offering fake flattery, calling the minister our friend from Africa like they'd spoken more than 3 words. He thought this was damage control. It wasn't. It was desperation in business casual clothing. When he finally stopped, I leaned forward. "Grant," I said, "do you know what the minister said to me?" His smile faltered. "Something about innovation?" He said this place punished me for doing the right thing. Silence. And I think he's right. Grant shifted, lips parting, but I didn't give him the chance. You want me back because I embarrassed you. Not because you see me, not because you value what I bring, and definitely not because you believe in fairness. His face flushed. But I'll give you this. You taught me something. He frowned. What's that? How to disappear in plain sight, and how to use that invisibility to see everything that matters. Later that day, I got a message from the minister's office, an invitation, not just to advise, but to travel with the delegation to their next summit. Johannesburg, Berlin, then Accra. My passport hadn't seen light in years. Suddenly it felt heavy with meaning. I emailed back one word, yes. Then I packed up my desk, all 3 drawers, it wasn't much, a couple of notebooks, a half-eaten protein bar, and the chalkboard from the tea station. I erased the last quote and replaced it with, open quote, turns out the tea guy knew everything, close quote, and left it propped up in the break room. I didn't say goodbye. I just left. Not out of spite, out of clarity, because sometimes walking away isn't quitting, it's graduating. The flight to Johannesburg was overnight, and I didn't sleep a wink. Not from nerves. Those had settled into something stranger. A calm, stubborn disbelief that this was real. That the same hands that once brewed morning tea for a floor full of people who never learned my name were now flipping through briefing notes for a continental trade summit. The minister greeted me at the airport like an old friend. Ready to earn that tea reputation on a global stage? He joked. I smiled, but inside, I was buzzing. There's a particular kind of fear that comes when someone powerful believes in you more than you believe in yourself. But he never treated me like a charity case. He treated me like a peer, like a quiet chess player who'd made one great move and just needed the board widened. We drove to the hotel in silence, jazz playing low. I watched the city pass by, sharp angles, bright color, people moving with purpose. It felt alive in a way my old job never had. And in the silence, I realized something. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted relevance. The summit wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. Think less United Nations drama, more ultra-polished startup pitch meets cultural diplomacy. Delegates wore suits with history woven into every thread. The air buzzed with 10 languages and one shared goal, collaboration without colonization. I was introduced not as an assistant or junior advisor, but simply by name. My seat had a placard. My tablet had briefing access. People looked at me when they spoke, and not just because I poured the tea. The minister didn't coddle me either. He challenged me in sessions. What would you propose? How would you evaluate this risk? Which cities could benefit most from cross-university innovation exchanges? At first, I fumbled, gave soft, vague answers to buy time. But one afternoon, during a panel on youth-led tech investment, something clicked. I remembered Femi, not as the minister's daughter, but as the intern whose ideas were being ignored because she didn't speak conference fluently. And suddenly I had something to say. I raised my hand, talked about visibility, about how the brightest minds are often the quietest ones, how mentorship and dignity are more valuable than funding. I told the story, not of her name, but of her experience. How small moments like being given a cup of tea instead of a brush off could ripple upward into transformation. When I finished, there was a pause, then applause. Not thunderous, but enough. Enough to feel like the room had truly listened. That night, the minister knocked on my door. "You found your voice," he said. "I think I borrowed someone else's for a minute," I joked. "No," he replied. "You just stopped whispering." Then he handed me a folder. Thick, cream-colored, government sealed. Inside was a proposal, a year-long appointment across 5 African nations to support youth entrepreneurship infrastructure. Not just advisory, leadership. I stared at it. "I'm not qualified," I said without thinking. He smiled. Neither was I, until someone told me I was. Back in my hotel room, I made myself tea from a little kettle by the desk. It wasn't perfect, overheated, slightly bitter, but it reminded me of the first cup I gave Femi, and the truth I'd learned since. Sometimes all you need to change a life is to notice it, and sometimes that life is your own. The first country on my new assignment was Ghana. I landed in Accra on a humid Tuesday afternoon, and the city greeted me like an orchestra tuning before a grand performance. Motorcycles weaving through traffic like percussion, vendors singing about their pineapples, and billboards layering politics, pop stars, and telecom ads all in one glance. It was overwhelming, and yet it felt right. My role wasn't ceremonial. I wasn't there to pose beside ribbon cuttings or nod through speeches. The work was real, gritty, complicated, layered. The project was about creating accessible pipelines between young entrepreneurs and international investors, especially those from underrepresented areas. But none of that came with a guidebook. So I did what I'd always done. I listened. In dusty classrooms, I listened to students with startup dreams sketched on the backs of math homework. In cramped workshops, I listened to women who built businesses from phone credit and courage. In open-air markets, I listened to vendors who spoke 5 languages but couldn't get a small business loan. And the more I listened, the more I understood. My job wasn't to empower anyone. It was to remove the nonsense blocking them from empowering themselves. One afternoon, I visited a youth tech hub in Kumasi. It had once been a disused community center. Now it buzzed with code, circuitry, and caffeine. The founder was a kid barely out of high school named Jojo, who built computers out of discarded parts and ran free coding lessons for neighborhood kids. He showed me a prototype, a simple app that mapped food vendors in the area and rated them by hygiene and pricing transparency. "It's nothing fancy," Jojo said, eyes flicking nervously toward my suit. "Just local." I looked him in the eye. "You mean, just exactly what's needed?" He blinked, and I saw something shift in him. Recognition, maybe, or the quiet realization that someone in a blazer saw him. I gave him my card. "Send me your pitch deck. I'll pass it along." He laughed. "Pitch what?" "Doesn't matter. Send me anything." We both laughed then. Not because it was funny, but because it was real. That night, I walked alone through the neighborhood where I was staying. Streetlights flickered, radios hummed. A group of kids played football with a deflated ball, arguing over whether it crossed the line. I stood for a moment, unnoticed, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel out of place. Not the T-boy, not the consultant, just a person walking the earth, trying to make it hurt a little less for someone else. I sent JoJo's project to a funder the next day. They replied in 4 hours. "We want to talk." I didn't tell JoJo immediately. I just waited until our next visit and handed him a small envelope. He opened it, read the letter, and looked at me like I'd just handed him the moon. "This is real?" he asked. Tea guy's honor. He laughed. He always did. And I realized that somewhere between that first cup of rooibos and this moment, my life had stopped being about redemption and started being about replication. Helping one person, then another, until the whole system tilts. If Ghana was the spark, then Berlin was the test. I arrived in winter, gray skies, icy wind, the kind of cold that slides under your coat and takes your confidence with it. It was the World Trade Innovation Forum, and I was the only delegate without a formal government title. Everyone else had acronyms after their names. I had tea stains on my notebook. But by then, I'd learned something funny about rooms like that. The most overdressed person is usually the least useful. My job in Berlin wasn't just to observe, it was to speak. The minister had arranged for me to present a short case study on youth-led microfinance systems in Africa, specifically JoJo's app and a women's collective in Senegal we were supporting. Just 10 minutes. Just a room full of diplomats, economists, and a handful of billionaires pretending they understood public transit. No pressure. I stood at the podium and did something I hadn't planned. I didn't open with data. I didn't quote white papers or cite glowing reports. I told the story of a girl named Awa in Dakar who traded hand-woven baskets for school fees, and how a $400 microloan let her build a business that paid for her siblings' tuition too. She doesn't need venture capital, I said. She needs space, trust, a chair at the table, or a new table entirely. The room was quiet. Then someone clapped, and then another, and then someone said, "Who is this guy?" That's when I knew. The tea had steeped. After the talk, a woman from a major Scandinavian bank approached me. "We want to pilot something. Small, local. Maybe Dakar. Can we partner?" I nodded. "You'll have to talk to Awa first. She's the CEO." She blinked, then smiled. "Fair," I added. "She makes a me mint tea too. Better than me." Back at the hotel that evening, I video called Jojo and Awa, patched them into a group chat, and gave them the news. They both thought I was joking. When they realized I wasn't, they started planning immediately, talking timelines, UI changes, training sessions. They didn't need me. That was the point. Berlin changed me, not because of the applause, but because it reminded me that legitimacy isn't granted by title. It's earned in small moments, earned by doing the work when no one's watching. The hotel concierge asked me, "Business or pleasure?" I said, "It's kind of the same now." She looked confused, but I wasn't, because once upon a time, they made me pour tea to belittle me. Now I pour it to begin meetings. By the time I touched down in Accra again, I wasn't just part of the project. I was leading it. We'd quietly rebranded the initiative as RippleWorks, an intentionally soft name. I didn't want it to sound like a Silicon Valley satellite. This wasn't about unicorn startups or exit strategies. It was about longevity, about practical hope. And people were paying attention. Even the media had caught on. Small features in regional papers, an op-ed I ghostwrote for the minister appearing in Le Monde Afrique, and one headline that made me laugh. "From tea to trade, the quiet architect behind Africa's youth economy shift." I sent that one to Grant. No caption. He left it on red. We were in the middle of setting up a mentorship lab in Nairobi when the email came. Subject line, "Confidential request from the UNDP." I thought it was spam, but it wasn't. They'd heard about RippleWorks. Through JoJo's pitch at a Pan-African developer conference, through Awa's microloan to millions story, through the Scandinavian partnership, and wanted us to consult on a new youth development framework. It would be unpaid, but it would be official. And more importantly, it would give our partners a seat at the real global table. I forwarded it to the team with one line. Open quote, "Looks like the kettle's boiling again." Close quote. 1 week later, I was on a panel call with 5 UN advisors, 2 NGO execs, and someone with an accent I couldn't place who kept calling me doctor. "I'm not a doctor," I said. "Ah," he replied, "but you fix things." It wasn't glamorous. It was spreadsheets, funding breakdowns, policy barriers, and long calls about cross-border banking rules. But it mattered. And when I walked into a cafe in Lagos one rainy afternoon and saw Jojo showing off his app to a group of college students, I felt something strange. Not pride, not joy, something deeper, belonging. A few days later, I got a text from the minister. Open quote, "We need to talk. You're going to want tea for this one." Close quote. We met in Accra at a quiet garden cafe he liked, the kind with overgrown vines and slow service, perfect for secrets. He looked older, not tired, but stretched, like someone who had carried too much good news without being allowed to rest. He didn't waste time. They offered me a diplomatic post in Geneva, he said. I raised an eyebrow. Wow. I said no. I told them my replacement is already here. I froze. Wait, me? You've already been doing the job. Why not do it with the title? I laughed out loud. Me? A government liaison? He sipped his hibiscus tea. You're not the tea boy anymore, remember? That night, I sat in my hotel room with the offer letter open on my laptop. It wasn't fame. It wasn't power. It was permanence. And I realized I wasn't scared of that anymore. And I said yes, quietly. No big announcement, just a digital signature, a soft click, and a long, slow exhale. My new title was vague enough to sound unimportant. Youth Economic Integration Consultant, West Africa Liaison, or something similarly sleep-inducing. But behind the title was real authority, access, influence, and the strangest part, people started calling me Sir. The transition wasn't seamless. Government work is molasses, thick, slow, and full of things that shouldn't be in there. Corruption, apathy, old loyalties. There were moments I missed the simplicity of pouring tea, because tea has no politics. You boil, you steep, you serve. Simple. But progress argues. It whines. It drags its feet. It tries to survive on yesterday's systems. I learned to navigate that. Slowly. I stopped expecting everyone to care. I stopped needing credit. I focused on the kids, the startups, the classroom chairs that used to be broken but now had legs again. I kept a file of quotes from students and entrepreneurs we helped. Not for social media, just for me. On bad days, I'd open it. Here's one from JoJo. The world didn't need to see me first, you did. That was enough. Here's another from Awa. You didn't save me. You listened. That was better. A year into the job, I returned to the city where it all started. Back to the office where I'd once been demoted to T-Boy. Back to the same elevator. The same hallway. Except now I was there for a keynote. The HR director, new one, greeted me with a blank smile. You've been here before? A few times, I said. I stepped into the auditorium and someone handed me a mic. I stood before a sea of employees, some who'd known me, many who hadn't, and I told them a story about a guy who used to pour tea and how being underestimated became his greatest advantage, and how kindness, when combined with competence, was unstoppable. Afterwards, someone from the old finance team came up. You're the reason Grant resigned, aren't you? I smiled. No, his ego did that. She laughed. We always wondered what happened after. I just left, I said, and kept walking. Back at my hotel that night, I brewed a cup of rooibos. No fancy kettle, no sugar, just the ritual. And I realized something. I wasn't the underdog anymore. I was the system now. But I still remembered how it felt to be overlooked. And I swore never to become the kind of person who needed to be reminded. It was my last week in Nairobi before rotating to a new post in Kigali. I'd grown used to packing up my life into carry-ons, used to tiny kettles in hotel rooms, and making friends with the front desk staff before anyone else. But this week was different. This week, JoJo and Awa were flying in for the first in-person RippleWorks regional roundtable. Just a dozen people. No press, no red carpets. But to me, it felt like a reunion of revolutionaries. They arrived wide-eyed and half-laughing, still in disbelief that a small idea born over shared tea and slow Wi-Fi had made it this far. Feels like we're doing something real now, Awa whispered. You always were, I said. Now the rest of the world just noticed. The meeting was beautiful. We sat in a bright room filled with plants and unmatching chairs, just as it should be. There were name tags, but we forgot to wear them. Everyone already knew each other, not by title, but by story. JoJo brought prototype sketches for a community learning app he'd been building. Awa presented a new co-op plan that used mobile banking to bypass exploitative middlemen. Every person there had once been too local, too untested, too small. Now they were shaping policy, rewriting frameworks, and changing lives, all because someone offered them space and listened. That night, as the city exhaled into dusk, JoJo pulled out a small square box. For you, he said. Inside was a custom ceramic mug, simple, handmade, with the RippleWorks logo carved into one side. On the other, Tea Guy. I laughed, hard, and I felt something crack open. Gratitude, disbelief, pride. All of it, warm and overwhelming. I raised the mug. To steeping quietly, I said, until it's strong enough to shake the table. Everyone smiled. Some wiped their eyes. We didn't toast. We didn't need to. Later, alone on the hotel balcony, I looked out over Nairobi's soft city lights. I thought about that first moment when I was told to serve tea like it was a punishment, and how that tiny act of dignity toward a stranger had looped back rewriting the script. It had led me here, not to revenge but to recognition, not to power but to purpose. And in that quiet, I finally exhaled. The world may not always see us, but when it does, it remembers. Open quote, open quote, open quote, waiting for summary, close quote, close quote, close quote.